Chapter 25. Madeline saw that the car was surrounded by armed Mexicans. They presented a contrast to the others she had seen that day. She wondered a little at their silence, at their respectful front. Suddenly a sharp order opened up the ranks next to the house. Senor Monts appeared in the break, coming swiftly. His dark face wore a smile. His manner was courteous, important, authoritative. "Senora, it's not too late." He spoke her language with an accent strange to her, so that it seemed to hinder understanding. "Senora, you got here in time. El Captain Stuart will be free." "Free?" she whispered. She rose, reeling. "Come," replied Monts, taking her arm. "Quick, senorita." Without his assistance, she would have fallen wholly upon Nels, who supported her on the other side. They helped her alight from the car, and for a moment the white walls, the hazy red sky, the dark figures of the rebels whirled before Madeline's eyes. She took a few steps, swaying between her escorts. Then the confusion of her sight and mind passed away. It was as if she was quickened with 1,000 vivifying currents, as if she could see and hear and feel everything in the world, as if nothing could be overlooked, forgotten, and neglected. She turned again, remembering Link. He was lurching from the car, helmet and goggles thrust back, the grey shade from his face. The cold, bright gleam of his eyes disappeared for something warmer. Senor Monts led Madeline and her cowboys through a hall to a patio, and on through a dark room with flooring of rough, bare boards that rattled, and into a smaller room full of armed, quiet rebels facing an open window. Madeline scanned the faces of these men, expecting to see Don Carlos, but he wasn't present. A soldier addressed her in Spanish too swiftly uttered, too voluble for her to translate. But like Senor Monts, he was gracious, and despite his ragged garb and uncouth appearance, he bore the unmistakable stamp of authority. Monts directed Madeline's attention to a man by the window. A loose scarf of vivid red hung from his hand. "Senora, they are waiting for the sun to set when we arrived. The signal was just about to be given for Senor Stuart's walk to death." "Stuart's walk?" echoed Madeline. "Ah, Senora, let me tell you his sentence, the sentence I have the honor and happiness to revoke for you." Stuart had been court-martialed and sentenced according to a Mexican custom observed in cases for brave soldiers to whom honorably and fitting executions were due. His hour had been set for Thursday, when the sun had sunk down. Upon the signal, he was to be liberated, and was free to walk out into the road and take any direction he pleased. He knew his sentence, knew that death awaited him, that every possible avenue of escape was blocked by men with rifles ready, but he had not the slightest idea at what moment or from what direction the bullets were to come. "Senora, we have sent messages to every squad of waiting soldiers, in order that El Capitan is not to be shot. He is ignorant of his release. I shall give the signal of his freedom." Monts was ceremonious and gallant and emotional. Madeline saw his pride, and divined that the situation was one which brought out the vanity, the ostentation, as well as the cruelty of his race. He would keep her in an agony of suspense, let Stuart start upon that terrible walk in ignorance of his freedom. It was the motive of a Spaniard. Suddenly, Madeline had a quaking fear that Monty lied, that he meant her to be a witness of Stuart's execution. But no, the man was honest. He was only barbarous. He would satisfy certain instincts of his nature, the sentiment, the romance, the cruelty, by starting Stuart upon that walk, by watching Stuart's actions in the face of seeming death, by seeing Madeline's agony of doubt, fear, pity, and love. Almost Madeline felt that she could not endure the situation. She was weak and tottering. "Signora, it will be one beautiful thing." Mance caught the scarf from the rebel's hand. He was glowing and passionate. His eyes had a strange, soft, cold flash, and his voice was low, intense. He was living something splendid in him. "I'll wave the scarf, Signora. That'll be the signal. It will be just down at the other end of the road. Signor Stuart's jailer will see the signal and take off Stuart's irons and release him, and open the door for him to walk. Stuart will be free, but he will not know. He'll expect death. As he's a brave man, he will face it. He will walk this way. Every step of that walk he will expect to be shot from unknown quarters. But he will not be afraid. Signora, I've seen El Capitan fighting in the field. What is death to him? Ah, it'll be magnificent to see him walk. Signora, you will see what a man he is. All the way he will expect cold, swift death. And here, at this end of the road, he will meet his beautiful lady." "Is there no possibility of mistake?" "No. My orders include an unloading of rifles." "What about Don Carlos?" "He is in irons and must answer to General Salazar," replied Mance. Madeline looked down the desert road. How strange to see the last ruddy glow of sun over the brow of the mountain range. The thought of that sunset had been torture for her, yet it had passed, and now the afterlights were luminous and beautiful and prophetic. With a heart stricken by both joy and agony, she saw Mance wave the scarf. And then she waited. No change manifested itself down the length of that lonely road. There was an absolute silence in the room behind her. How terribly, infinitely long seemed the wait. Never in all her future life would she forget the quaint pink, blue, and white walled houses with their colored roofs. That dusty, bare road, resembling one of the uncovered streets of Pompeii, with its look of centuries of solitude. Suddenly, a door opened, and a tall man stepped out. Madeline recognized Stuart. She had to place both hands on the windowsill for support, while a storm of emotion swayed her, and like a retreating wave it rushed away. Stuart lived. He was free. He had stepped out into the light. She had saved him. Life changed for her in that instant of realization and became sweet, full, and strange. Stuart shook hands with someone on the doorway, and then he looked up and down the road. The door closed behind him, and leisurely he rolled a cigarette and stood close to the wall while he scratched a match. Even at that distance, Madeline's keen eyes caught the small flame and the first puff of smoke. Stuart then took to the middle of the road and leisurely began his walk. To Madeline, he appeared natural, walking as uncertainly as if he was strolling for pleasure, but the absence of any living thing, the silence, the red haze, the supercharged atmosphere, they were all unnatural. From time to time, Stuart turned to face towards houses and corners. Only silence greeted those significant moves of his. Once he altered to roll and light another cigarette. After that, his step quickened. Madeline watched him, with pride, love, and pain, glory combating for a mastery upon her. This walk of his seemingly took longer than all her hours of wakenness, of strife, of remorse, longer than the ride to find him. She felt that it would be impossible for her to wait until he reached the end of the road. Yet in the hurry and riot of her feeling, she was fleeting panic. What could she say to him? How meet him? Well, she remembered the tall, powerful form now growing close enough to distinguish its dress. Stuart's face, yet only a dark gleam. Soon she would see it. Long before he could know that she was there, she wished to run to him and meet him. Nevertheless, she stood rooted in her covert behind the window, living that terrible walk with him to the utmost thought of home, sister, mother, sweetheart, wife, life itself. Every thought that could come to a man that stalked to meet his executioners. With all that tumult in her mind and heart, Madeline still fell prey to the incomprehensible variations of emotion that were possible to a woman. Every step Stuart took thrilled her. She had some strange, subtle intuition that he was not unhappy, and that he believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was walking to his death. His steps dragged a little, though they had begun to be swift. The old, hard, physical, wild nerve of the cowboy was perhaps in conflict with spiritual growth of the finer man, realizing too late that life ought not to be sacrificed. Then the dark gleam that was his face took shape and grew sharper and clearer. He was stalking now, and there was a suggestion of impatience in his stride. It took these hidden Mexicans a long time to kill him. At a point in the middle of the road, even with the corner of a house and opposite to Madeline's position, Stuart halted stock still. He presented a fair mark to his executioners, and he stood there motionless for a full moment. Only silence greeted him. Plain it was to Madeline, and she thought to all who had eyes to see, that to Stuart, since for some reason he had been spared all along his walk, this was the moment he ought to be mercifully shot. But, as no shots came, a rugged dignity left him for a reckless scorn manifest in the way he strolled across to the corner of the house and rolled yet another cigarette and presented a broad breast to the window and smoked and waited. That wait was almost the unending for Madeline. Perhaps it was only a moment, several moments at the longest, but the time seemed like a year. Stuart's face was scornful and hard. Did he suspect treachery on the part of his captors? That they meant to play with him as a cat with a mouse, to murder him at leisure? Madeline was sure she caught the old inscrutable mocking smile fleeting across his lips. He held that position for what must have been a reasonable time in his mind. Then with a laugh and a shrug he threw the cigarette into the road. He shook his head as if the incomprehensible motives of the men who could have no fair reason now for delay. He made a sudden violent action that was more than a straightening of his powerful frame. It was the old instinct violence. And then he faced north. Madeline read his thoughts, knew he was thinking of her, calling her a last silent farewell. He would picture her in his last breath and leave her free. Keep his secret. That picture of him, dark-browed, fire-eyed, strangely sad and strong, sank into Madeline's heart of hearts. The next instant he was striding forward, to force by bold and scornful presence a speedy fulfillment of his sentence. Madeline stepped into the door, crossing the threshold. Stuart staggered, as if indeed the bullets he expected had pierced him in mortal wound. His dark face turned white. His eyes had the rapture stare, the wild fear of a man who saw an apparition, yet who doubted his sight. Perhaps he had called to her as the Mexicans called to their virgin. Perhaps he imagined sudden death had come unawares, and that this was her image appearing to him in some other life. Who are you?" he whispered hoarsely. She tried to lift her hands and failed, tried again, and then held them out trembling. "It is I, Majesty, your wife." End of Light of the Western Stars.